I'm waiting for the mass exodus for lunch, and we'll get started momentarily. Right. Ready? All right. Well, welcome back for the afternoon session. We have two presentations, and then we'll have a short break and then move into the roundtables. So I want to thank World Arena again for the opportunity to participate this year. I think it's been another excellent conference, and all the participants make this worthwhile, so appreciate everybody's interaction. So our next presenter is Thomas Weissinger. He's Director Environmental with Raven Power, and he's going to speak on NOx RACT issues, and I think maybe specifically to Maryland. So welcome. And watch your step.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, again, I'm Tom Weissinger. I am with Raven Power up in Baltimore, Maryland, so a little bit out of place here, but I do feel at home because I spent 4 of my best years down here at Georgia Tech, so I know Atlanta well, and I love the South. Before I get started, though, I was leading a roundtable yesterday, and with some of the snickers I was hearing when people mentioned Donald Trump, I decided that I wanted to take an informal poll of the folks attending my roundtable as to who would you vote for if the presidential election were held today. And I had, I think, 22 folks place their secret ballots, and I promised that I would reveal the results today. I have to warn you, I guess two things. The margin of error on this poll is probably plus or minus 100%. And I'm glad you're all sitting, because when I saw the results, I had to sit down. Bernie Sanders won. He had 6 votes. Trump and Carson were tied with Hillary with 3, Rubio with 2. And somebody really couldn't decide and just put down a Republican. So I don't know, how do you really interpret these, but I'll leave that up to you. I may be looking to buy land in the Caribbean after this election. So I'll talk about Raven Power and Talon, who I now work for, some background on NOx regulations in Maryland, kind of how we got to this point, and go through the regulatory development and negotiation process that we've been dealing with for the past couple of years to lower NOx limits. Present what we finally ended up with as final NOx regs, NOx RACT, and go through how our plants did this year, and then touch briefly on the new ozone standard coming up that could affect other folks for NOx. Even though NOx seems to be, a passé topic, I think the new standard may reinvigorate the need to control. So I say I work for Raven Power, but I guess I have an identity crisis because I also work for Talen Energy. Talen is a newly formed publicly traded company formed by the merger of the PPL energy supply, deregulated assets in Pennsylvania and Montana, along with the assets owned by Riverstone Holdings, a private equity firm out of Houston. And that's where Raven, we were owned by Riverstone, merged with the PPL assets, and now we are known as Talen Energy. Although we're a little subsidiary and still operate semi-independently in Raven in Maryland. So Raven is these 3 coal plants, Brandon Shores, the newest, circa late 80s, early 90s, 2 larger units, scrubbed, SCR, basically all the bells and whistles except carbon capture. Weissinger has got 2 coal units. They're on the older side, along with the crane units. They're vintage 1960s. And none of those are scrubbed. We'll see later. Weissinger has one of the 2 units, coal units has an SCR. So why was Maryland looking at additional NOx regulations back in 2013? Well, Baltimore has been a non-attainment area for ozone for really forever in my career. They're recently a moderate non-attainment area based on the 2008 standard of 75 ppb. And 2012 was a particularly bad, warm summer, and up in Maryland, it's the heat, the summer heat is really what drives code red ozone days. And so the state, Maryland Department of Environment, was looking at further troubles in trying to attain the standard at that time. They also owed EPA a RACT SIP, an updated RACT SIP, and Maryland has been pointing the finger upwind for quite some time, saying that we get, I forget the numbers, but it's like as much ozone or more that comes in overnight, and they've done all this monitoring up in the upper atmosphere and modeling, complex models, to show that it's all coming in to Maryland. So our air director has been touring the country, if you will, talking to other air directors saying, you have controls on your coal plants in your state, but nobody's running them. Nobody's using those SCRs. You should be doing that. And then in 2013, he had an embarrassing moment when he realized that his own coal plants, we were not always running our controls, because really the only driver, the primary driver, was CARE at that time. And Casper was, I think, intended to drive upwind states to use controls, but it was still in limbo. So he had to bring us coal plants to the table, and we started discussing running our controls in the summertime. So the major coal plants, I've mentioned our units. As you can see, Brandon Shores is fairly well controlled for NOx, low NOx burners, OFA, booze, burners out of service. So that, in fact, has been one challenge for us. It's not true OFA, over fire air, and so it's really not as effective at controlling NOx. Likewise, the low NOx burners came in, they were like first generation, so there are better low NOx burners out there. So the combustion NOx that we have is a real challenge and really pushes the SCR to its limits. Weissinger 2 has an SNCR, 3 has an SCR, and both the smaller crane units have SNCRs. NRG was also mixed into this. They have really the equivalent generation capacity in Maryland as we do with coal, at their Morgantown, Chalk Point, and Dickerson units. And they're all controlled in some form with 3 SCRs. Yeah, so the irony is that Maryland not only had NOx RACT limits, although they really weren't very stringent at 0.5 to 0.7 pound per million. That was really from years ago. But in 2009, they implemented what we call the Healthy Air Act. It was a legislative solution to drive down NOx and SO2 at all the coal units. That's what drove the installation of the SNCRs on all the smaller, older units. So again, the levels for the HAA, Healthy Air Act, as you can see in the graph, are considerably lower than the allowance allocations our system was getting from CARE for the ozone season. So again, in theory, that should be driving emissions from the Maryland coal plants down. It's a hard cap, no trading outside of the state. You can average, or you can, average within your system, within the state. So that's a system-wide total cap there. But it's considerably lower than CARE. So it should have been driving emissions down. But the irony is, even in 2012, when we were meeting the Healthy Air Act limits, you can see Raven's emissions there, the state still had plenty of code red days. So peak summer days is really the driver in Maryland for driving NOx reductions. And that's what I think the rest of the country in the upwind states you may see sometime in the not too distant future. So this, let's see. All right, so this is a slide that MDE brought to the table to demonstrate the peak summer day issue that we've got. These are a handful of the code red days, ozone exceedance days in 2012, with total pounds of NOx on the y-axis, each day represented on the x-axis, and then all of the different coal units represent different bars. I guess if you look, there are a couple of bars that are really low, and those are the SCR controlled units. But when you look at these peak days, I think the yellow, well, the ones to the right of the yellow are our crane units, have SNCRs, but he realized that we weren't using the SNCRs and were emitting a significant number of pounds, tons, during these days. So that was what really brought us all together at the table. So Maryland proposed an open stakeholder process. It was more or less driven by politics. It brought us, NRG, and Sierra Club together with MDE at the table to work through these new regulations. Now that sounds like it's nice and open and transparent, but you put industry and Sierra Club together at the same table, it's not going to be that easy to negotiate limits. So, but it worked. It just took a considerable amount of time, and really the state was pushing for us to run our controls. It evolved into 2 phases. One was to, during the ozone season, run your controls that you already have, but the politics side kind of drove this phase 2, which was eventually Maryland wanted the smaller SNCR controlled units to upgrade to SCRs. Now for a 120 megawatt unit, that doesn't make financial sense and never will. But the politics came into play because our governor at the time is Martin O'Malley, who was also running for president, and that was already becoming apparent back then. The story goes that he really wanted to have an environmental legacy in Maryland. So he was pushing for some kind of major change at the coal plants in Maryland, hence the phase 2. So it was easy for MDE to say, we just want you to run your controls. Well, in fact, we were running the SCRs, but the numbers that we had in 2012, the average ozone season levels were like 0.13 pound per million. They were proposing that if you run your controls, you should be able to achieve 0.05 to 0.1. So, well, it just doesn't equate. And so really what we found was that the historic data that we had for when we were running our controls just didn't meet the numbers that they were looking for. In fact, the numbers they got were plotting our emission rate versus load and more or less taking the bottom, the lowest dots on the curve. So that was a challenge. But what it ended up doing, we agreed that we may be able to do better than we've done historically. We've never had to focus on NOx. If we had to focus on NOx, we could probably do better. So let's spend this summer of 2014 actually focused on NOx controls and see how low we could go. So that's what we ended up with was a summer study where we ran the controls and we also evaluated improvements that could be made. There's a fine line there, though. We didn't want to, I know this won't sound good, but we didn't want to do too good because if it's turning into a limit, and if we present the best of the best, that's hard to meet on a 24/7, 365 basis. But we found there was plenty of room for improvement. We looked at combustion, tuning of the boilers for NOx, improvements in staging for the OFAs, burner configurations. One of the big things was rapid maintenance response. When all you have to meet is an annual or even an ozone season NOx limit, if your ammonia injection goes down, well, you'll get to it tomorrow. But for peak summer ozone days, that's not getting you where you need to be. So minimizing startup shutdown issues and the time it took to start the system up. And also looking at low load restrictions. With an SCR, you need temperature for the reaction to take place. So when we come down at any point, we lose the temperature and obviously we're not controlling as well as we could. Well, 2014, it turns out, was a nice, cool summer, which helped ozone and actually ended up helping Maryland have the first 3 years in attainment ever when they look at 12, 13, and 14 as an average. But it meant low dispatch for our units. We had few hours of operation, which meant our evaluations were very limited, and we really couldn't judge how we could do in the future based on a limited data set. Well, this is an example. We collected a lot of data, had all the plant process engineers involved. So this is a plot of NOx rate, hourly NOx rate on the y-axis versus gross megawatts. And the state had been looking at maybe a 0.08 pound per million limit for this particular unit, Brandon 2. So the data there is the 8 weeks, 2 months of data, July to August. It says filtered for SCR operations because even in 2014, when things went wrong, when things went wrong or when we were starting up, shutting down, we didn't have the ammonia injection. So we had to filter that out because that would skew the results. We were truly looking at how good can we do when we have the SCR on. You can see in this particular unit, again, because of the burners out of service and some other boiler configuration issues, full load gets us some pretty good NOx. The black lines there then actually represent, well, the one is 0.08, where they were proposing, but the 0.15 is the higher one here on the right. That's where we ended up for a two-tiered limit, which was part of the negotiations. And one of the successes of running a summer study is that this unit, more so than any other unit, has problems achieving low NOx at full load. So we were able to negotiate a higher rate for full load operation than at low load. The flip side was we kind of had to give something, which meant instead of 0.08, at the rest of the load range, it looked like we were doing pretty well, so we accepted a 0.07. We accepted a lower limit from, let's say, 300 to 650. That's compromise for you, right? Nobody's ever fully happy. Again, the limited data set meant that we looked good, looked like 0.15 would be no problem. But when we looked back at SCR operating conditions for the full year, including the winter when we had sustained runs of full load because of the cold winter, you can see NOx, this was with the SCR running, but when you have sustained full load operation and burners are doing crazy things, NOx was a problem at that point. So it really justified that two-tier limit. So at the end, it was fall of 2014, MDE came out with the regulation that we agreed to. It, again, had two phases. Phase one was focused on short-term emissions for the next 4 years, 2015 to 2019. Two things. One was a daily limit. I'll get to that, but I guess also they threw in a 30-day rolling average during the ozone season for the system. We like averaging, especially if it's in an air shed. It's the same tons of NOx will form ozone, whether it's from this unit or that unit. So averaging works well, especially over 30 days. So with our system, we agreed to a 0.15 pound per million system-wide average. But on a daily basis, we agreed to run the controls. And in fact, the language in the regulation says minimize NOx emissions by operating and optimizing. That was never part of the negotiation. Optimizing NOx and combustion controls. So we're a little disappointed there because it's very vague and it's truly up to the discretion of the regulator, of our inspector, whether they think that we did that. That's the bottom line. We also had to develop a NOx control plan that said how we would do that. So that's somewhat of a guide for them and for us to follow, to say this is how you're going to run your controls. But again, it's at their discretion. I guess the saving grace is that they put in these target rates. They're not limits, but it's a 24-hour average for each unit, that if you can meet these target NOx emission rates, you don't have to report anything. You don't have to provide any explanation of how you were running or how you were running well. So if you can stay under these, the presumption is you're always going to be in compliance. If you're not, there were a number of exemptions provided that were presumptive allowances saying you were still to be in compliance. So that's low load, again, without the right temperatures on the SCR. Maximum emergency generation if PJM calls us to run at full load because there's insufficient generation and we have to push everything, we were exempted there, as well as startup and shutdown. Phase two of the reg, again, they wanted a game changer. So they came out saying for smaller SNCR controlled units, by June of 2020, either install an SCR, convert to natural gas, or you shut down. So the shutdown option is specifically listed in the regulation. We ended up agreeing to this. From a business plan standpoint, looking at the likely age of these smaller units, a 2020 date is something we could accept. NRG, on the other hand, even though they're similar aged units, they really wanted to fight for every bit of flexibility in the future. So they challenged this regulation. So then politics got real interesting, and I don't see a clock, so I better, all right. Bottom line, we had a change in governor. He yanked these regs because they're basically forcing shutdowns for these units. He yanked the reg on the day he was inaugurated. So it's really been fun politically in Maryland. Sierra Club went crazy, and they've been fighting ever since. We've since gotten a flexibility provision added that in addition to those three options, you can also meet a much lower 24-hour block average. But just this week, Sierra Club got the legislature to put a hold on these regs, so it's still up in the air. 2015, though, with these new regulations in place, the Raven fleet did really well. Our the highest 30-day rolling average emission rate was 0.09 versus the limit of 0.15. Some of that was pure dispatch that the SCR units ran and the SNCR controlled units didn't. But still, that was good. And then back to those target rates, if you exceed those target rates on any given day, you have to send in an explanation and further data on what was going on with your SCR, your injection, your ammonia injection, et cetera. So that's a summary of how we did. Startup, shutdown, I've put in there, those were the reasons for the majority of the reporting days. But we consider that every day that we had a target level exceedance, there was a very justifiable technical reason for that, and we minimized the time frame. So time will tell if MDE comes knocking on our door. But another graph of how we've done here with NOx emission rates, starting with 2012, those numbers I presented earlier. The higher ones are obviously the SNCR controlled units when they really weren't being run very much, and the lower ones the SCR, but everything has gone down since 2012 for all 6 of our units. So looking ahead, we just had the new 8-hour ozone standard promulgated, dropping it down to 70. This is a little map from EPA's website indicating currently what counties are not attaining that level. It's pretty much the usual suspects in the urban areas. I think we heard earlier, and I saw the same thing on EPA's website, that after all of the changes for MATS and everything else go into place and all the coal plant shutdowns occur, that they don't expect much to be needed in the long run to be able to attain this. So we'll see. And the states will go through their attainment designation processes. Again, I think Maryland doesn't quite make the 70, but again, the irony, we just attained the 75, and now they dropped the standard. So if you were in an area that may be moderate non-attainment, again, the states will have 6 years for all the sources to attain, to meet the regs to allow the attainment to be obtained. Transport, again, I think that's why this is very Maryland focused, but I'm suspicious that more folks in upwind states may be facing similar pressures to run your controls and try to optimize NOx emissions on during the ozone season. So even though CSAPR was just reinstituted, if you will, for this year, we expect a new CSAPR rule to be coming out by the end of the year to address not only the items that the court told them to address, but to now address the 2008 standard, which again is just funny because I guess CSAPR was addressing the 97 standard. Now that we have a 2015 standard, they're going to go back and address the 2008 standard. We'll catch up with ourselves at some point. But it's really driven by allowance costs. I think when with these market-based systems, that'll always be the driver. The numbers that we looked at as part of this process is even with the capital costs already sunk for the SCRs, it costs about $500 to $1,000 per ton removed just in operating costs. And currently the ozone season CSAPR allowances are trading for $220 a ton. So if you're not forced to run your controls by your state, at least for the foreseeable future, we'll be breathing your ozone in Maryland. So that's it.